you're down in spring training right now in Jupiter, spending a lot of time with the team. And I just wanted to ask a couple questions here. So
Sure.
who do you think has had a particularly impressive first week? Has anybody really like stood out since you've been down there?
Yeah, I think when you think about the guys who early in spring have caught a lot of eyes, I think that probably, well, so the one we got that Oliver Marmol named the other day, that Nolan Gorman was a guy who showed up
Yeah.
in kind of shape they were hoping for with the kind of swing changes they were definitely really hoping for. And then in terms of just sort of, the pitchers who've been going at it and they're early going, I think the really encouraging thing is that Steven Matz threw a light bullpen today, faced hitters and looked strong, looked like himself, looked like the ball was coming out well, and looked like the guy who they needed when they signed last year, and also frankly looked like the guy who I think maybe they thought they had was kind of rounding into form before he had that weird that weird injury in Cincinnati when his knee kind of went out from underneath him. So I think Matz would be a guy to be encouraged about for sure in the early going.
That's really good to hear. I think with Matt's, this rotation gets so much deeper, and we have a great shot to contend with that. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, for sure. And that really is going to be one of the more interesting parts of this, is trying to whittle down that rotation group because it's a pretty firm five. It's really hard to imagine anybody breaking into that group of five. And actually, that was part of the conversation this morning. Was what do you say to guys like Dakota Hudson, like Drew Verhagen, like Jake Woodford in terms of competition? And the answer is, they're here to compete, right? They're professionals. They understand what's expected of them, and they will figure it out, or they won't, which solves the problem in the other way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and sort of in the same, we all know Paul DeYoung's had struggles in the past few seasons. Have you seen any improvements in his game and in this spring? And have you? Which other players do you think have the most to prove this spring as well?
Yeah, in terms of DeYoung, we were actually this morning taking a little bit of inventory in terms of the guys who are here, guys who we have and haven't seen on the field. And Paul DeYoung is one of the very few guys who we have not seen yet on the field, whether it's a live VP or hitting VP or whatever. And I mean, part of that is going to be by design, right? He's down here doing his work, but a lot of it is happening inside the cages, inside the hitter's shed out here. And part of that, I'm sure, is to maybe not keep eyes off of them, but maybe just a little bit more of a controlled setting and to try to control those expectations. So in terms of what that looks like, I don't have a good answer. I think we'll see a lot once the games start and we see what he looks like at game speed, as well as sort of, how he looks shifting around the infield, because I think it's fair to expect he's going to get reps at least at second and third in addition to short this spring. To be a utility infielder, he's going to have to be able to play those spots. So I do think there's something to be said for that.
So Paul DeYoung is going to be seen mainly as a bench bat. I know Mo said he believed in Paul DeYoung's ability to still contribute to the team.
For sure.
Not viewing him in any starting role, more as like a bench bat defensive replacement type of player.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's gotten to a point now where it's been long enough and the results have been what they have been, that it's really hard for them to keep into a season expecting him to be more than that, especially considering what they've gotten out of Edmund and what they got out of Brendan Donovan last year, the expectations they have for Gorman. There's not a spot for DeYoung that fits the starting lineup right now. If things change and all of a sudden the season starts and he's 2019 Paul DeYoung and he's hitting 240 and on pace to hit 30 homers, then they'll figure out a way to get him in the lineup. That falls in the category, I guess, of problems that solve themselves. But I think at the start of the season, it's fair to expect him to be more in that bench role, utility infielder kind of spot.
So do you think they're going to stick with him on the roster, or do you think maybe a trade to a different team where he could get perhaps?
I think the fact that he made it to spring with the Cardinals is probably an indication that he makes it through the spring. Now, again, if he comes out in spring and he's hitting the cover off the ball and he looks rejuvenated, revitalized, maybe there's something to be said there. The reality with DeYoung is that he's still owed a guaranteed $11 million. It's $9 million for this season, then $2 million on the buyout for next season, which is, it's just too big a ticket for a guy who has sort of shown the struggles that he's shown in recent years, right? So if a trade is going to be a possibility, even a trade where the Cardinals need a significant amount of the money, he's going to have to show more, because really is Paul DeYoung right now a $5 million player? If you're a team that has a utility infielder that you like, is the difference between that player, who probably is a younger, pre-arb, maybe even player, the salary difference between that and whatever the Cardinals may or may not cover, is still going to be substantial. And I think the teams, especially early in the year, they like to give their own guys shots, and they're probably not inclined to take that kind of risk.
That makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people are looking at DeYoung and they're sort of saying that they don't see a spot for him on the active roster because you only can carry 26 players. It seems DeYoung's going to be on the roster at least to start the season. I don't think there's a great chance he's left off. I'd be really surprised. But with him on the roster, there's not a ton of room for flexibility and bringing up young names that a lot of Cardinals fans haven't heard. But even with that being said, is there anybody who Cardinals fans don't know about right now that has a great shot at making the roster?
I think the guy, and I think maybe more and more Cardinals fans do know him at this point, but the guy that comes to mind is Moises Gomez, just because that's a guy who hasn't been in the big leagues before, and who did so much power-wise last season that the Cardinals are going to be willing to give him a shot. And if he hits and he really hits his way out of the roster, then they're going to be able to make a spot for him. There are some redundancies, right? You look at Juan Yepes and Gomez, and you see these are sort of similar players. You look at Nolan Gorman and Alec Burleson, and to an extent, these are similar players. And so figuring out a way for those guys to fit in is interesting. The other guy I would say here, and again, somebody that Cardinals fans probably know but haven't known recently maybe, is Oscar Mercado. Oscar Mercado is a guy who they drafted, developed, came up through the system, and then got traded in 2018 as sort of part of, a 40-man churn, didn't have a good spot for him. Back in camp now, is in a spot where, is he the best defensive center fielder they have in camp? Maybe, arguably so, right? And they made that roster spot for Ben DeLuzio at the end of last season to be that kind of player, to be a defensive center fielder, to be a pinch runner. And those are roles that Mercado can fill. Today, actually, I watched him take live BP against Matt Liberatore, and he had a really good, like a 9-pitch at bat. He was fouling off, and then, drove a line drive right back through the box against Liberatore. So it was, looked like a professional hitter, right? This is a guy who has experience, who's had success in the big leagues before. And I could easily see climbing into a spot where he makes it really hard to send him to Memphis at the end of spring.
Interesting.
So I guess another name that Cardinal fans are probably more familiar with is Jordan Walker. I know he's probably doesn't have a spot in the starting lineup as is, but do you think the Cardinals will give him every opportunity to make the roster this spring with the World Baseball Classic and players not really being around the team?
Yeah, I do. I think that, if you were looking to gamble on who was going to have the most at-bats for the Cardinals in spring training, I think that Walker would be an interesting bet, right? And you're going to see him play all over the outfield, primarily in the corners. It wouldn't totally shock me if he got some game action at center, but not very much. But you're going to see him in the corners, and you're going to see him have that opportunity, right? Because with the talent level and the sort of advanced professional hitter that he is, it's strange to say that a guy who hasn't yet gotten to AAA doesn't have a lot to prove at AAA. That being said, what they've seen from him at the earlier levels and what they saw from him in the AFL, last winter, there's really. Walker will have some developing to do. He has some defensive stuff he's going to have to figure out. He's been playing the outfield for like 6 months, right? But he's as a hitter, he looks like a polished professional hitter. And if he's the kind of guy who can contribute and can be, a sort of top tier starter off the bat, they're going to give him the shot to show that he can do that.
Speaking of the AFL, that reminded me that I really wanted to talk about Connor Thomas. What is his role moving forward after absolutely dominating last fall? How do they see him impacting the team this season?
Yeah, the challenge for Connor Thomas is going to be that there are so many pitchers who are in competition for those spots, right? There are 8 left-handers or so who conceivably any 2 of them could break camp with the team and be part of that big league bullpen. He's going to have to rise above, but they're going to give him every opportunity to do so. They saw him put in the work in the fall. They saw him really kind of radically change the pitcher he is. He's talked a lot about this. Actually, I wrote about this earlier this week, that he was just sort of playing catch down here, and Jason Isringhausen was around and showed him the cutter grip that he used. And then all of a sudden, Thomas reversing that for a lefty became really unhittable through the AFL. And again, talk about a guy who has shown what he can do at Memphis, who has that kind of professional level of experience. To me, Thomas is a guy who you will see make his major league debut this season. The question is going to be where that comes and in what capacity. I would expect him to come out of the bullpen for sure, but I do think there's a world where if the bullpen competition in camp starts to trend away from him, and then maybe not even by any fault of his own, just there's so much depth that maybe it looks like he's not going to be able to break through. I can imagine a scenario where he gets back onto a starter's plan and then becomes that 6th, 7th starter where you need an emergency start. You can get Connor Thomas or Memphis to pop up and make a start like that. I could see him in that kind of role, or maybe even as a bigger contributor out of the bullpen more regularly.